Hey everyone, welcome back to Tech Talk. I'm Julia Beauchamp. I am here with Computer World Executive Editor Ken Mingus, as well as CSO Senior Writer JM Porup. We are streaming live on the CSO LinkedIn as well as YouTube, and today we are talking about printers, the overlooked security threat in your enterprise. It's more likely than you think. Thank you so much for coming in, JM, or for
Always a
zooming
pleasure,
in.
Juliet.
Really appreciate it. So, like I said, printers can be sort of an overlooked security threat. When you first think of them, you think, okay, they print stuff, they copy stuff, they fax stuff, which I have used one time, but there's more to printer security than meets the eye.
Indeed. So printers are typically deployed with internet connections to very sensitive parts of the enterprise and tend to print very sensitive documents. But unlike the printers of, say, 20 years ago, which printed and maybe copied if you were lucky, the modern printer is a web server, FTP server, fax machine, fax server, deploys web applications that often don't pass the top 10 criteria. And it's essentially a fully functioning server in your enterprise that anybody can walk up to and stick a USB stick into. And the security standards are typically not very high for the deployment and maintenance of these devices. And given the sensitive nature of documents that tend to get printed, our sense is that enterprises need to pay a little bit more attention to the security of their printers.
You know, it's interesting, Jay. One of the things I was wondering in looking at your last story, it seems like there's a lot of confusion about how these things should be managed and who should be basically responsible for making sure that printers are, patched in a timely manner, that, that someone's basically paying attention to the security. Is that one of the issues here?
Yeah, no, I think that there's very much an organizational issue at play here because most printers are deployed and managed by outsourced third parties who, all they do is install and maintain printers on an outsourced basis for their customers. And there's intense competition for lowest price and fastest response time, but typically those contracts don't specify security. Based on my research, it would appear that many security manufacturers are doing okay in terms of deploying security features. However, because there are financial and organizational incentives to just make it work as cheaply and fast as possible, those security settings are not being turned on. And because in a large organization, where does the buck stop becomes a serious question. And it seems to me that printers are often overlooked by CISOs or CISOs in terms of who is ultimately responsible for the security of those devices.
That makes sense. Yeah, it figures it to be something because I think printers are so sort of innocuous and also ubiquitous. You don't really think of them as an attack vector that can, open your company up to attacks. Are there specific kinds of attacks that printers are vulnerable to, or are they just as vulnerable to everything that can basically attack any connected device?
Well, in many cases, printers are running insecure web applications that are easy to exploit remotely. Also, a thing to consider is that your modern printer stores everything to a very, very large hard drive before printing and are typically not securely deleted. So there have been instances where, for instance, healthcare organizations have been fined by regulatory bodies for disposing of printers that still contained, the sensitive medical records of, thousands and thousands of people. So thinking about, the physical security as well as the internet connected security of printers is something that should very much be on the minds of a security administrator or a CISO.
So I'm wondering if printers are often an overlooked security threat, and it's sort of debated whether or not this responsibility falls on the shoulders of the CSO or the CISO, what are the steps that CSOs or CISOs should be taking in order to ensure that their printers are safe? I mean, I imagine they're already making sure that all of their networks are safe, making sure to educate employees about proper security techniques. What should additionally be going on in terms of printers?
Well, every organization is organized a little bit differently.
Hmm.
In many, but not all cases, there is a CIO who is responsible for the purchasing and deployment of IT resources. And it's important that whoever is in charge of security, the CISO or a security manager, depending on their job title, raise these issues with the CIO to ensure that, for instance, a great place to start is procurement. When you negotiate with a managed printer service provider, your contract should stipulate, bare minimum security requirements, and that's the beginning of solving this problem. Your procurement should not just specify price and maintenance time; it should also specify minimum security concerns. And then beyond that, the question internally is, who is auditing the performance from a security perspective of your managed print services provider, and ultimately, where does the buck stop? Who is ultimately responsible for the security of those devices?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I was looking back at some of the previous coverage this year that you've done and others have done at CSO, and one of the statistics that jumped out at me that was surprising, just to sort of indicate how serious a problem this is that there was an IDC survey earlier this year that found that 35% of all security breaches in Office were traced back to an unsecured printer or multifunction device, which just indicates that this is clearly something that hackers are attacking, because obviously if 35% of these things are coming in on the printer, then this is a serious vulnerability. Is there any sense that companies are aware of this now, or becoming more aware of this problem?
Little by little, I would say that my impression, my very unscientific impression, is that by and large, this problem continues to be overlooked by a majority of organizations. Some verticals are particularly badly affected and have begun to move forward, specifically healthcare. Because there are many enterprises that are going more and more paperless, where you just don't need to print stuff out, because why would you? But there are verticals where paper is a critical and non-negotiable part of the interaction with a client or a patient, and that includes healthcare, where things have to get printed out. Sensitive things have to get printed out. Prescriptions, diagnostic reports, the list goes on and on. These things almost inevitably get printed out. And healthcare security has a poor track record in terms of information security, but a growing awareness. I feel that it would be fair to say many healthcare organizations are much more aware of these issues than they were even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. And thinking about their printers as part of that overall problem, I think there's starting to be a little bit of traction, at least in that vertical.
Interesting. And just again, to all of our viewers, as a reminder, we're streaming live on the CSO LinkedIn page as well as our Tech Talk YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment below. We'll get to them towards the end of our broadcast. And JM, I have a question for you following up on you saying that healthcare is more susceptible to having maybe not necessarily hacked printers, but printers are by and large part of are used daily in the healthcare industry. How does that, obviously they're handling a lot of sensitive data, but they're also handling data that that is patient data, so therefore needs to be protected by HIPAA. How is HIPAA tied to this? Are there any sort of HIPAA breaches as a result of misuse of or poor printer security?
Yes, no, there have been fines under HIPAA in the multi-million-dollar range to healthcare organizations for failing to perform due diligence in securing their printers. I don't have HIPAA right in front of me. However, there are numerous requirements under HIPAA that say things like, you must perform minimum due diligence in securing stuff.
Yeah.
Usually in that kind of generic language, to not specify specific controls. But if you are a HIPAA-covered entity, then you must perform at least minimum due diligence in securing PHI. And if you're not doing so, then you are exposing yourself not just to regulatory fines, but also damage to your infrastructure and potential loss or damage of PHI.
In thinking about the various ways that printers can be attacked, I wonder, given the fact that so much of the workforce now is more of a mobile workforce, if people are using tablets or phones and they're trying to print out documents to a corporate printer, is there another layer of vulnerability sort of in the mobile sphere that companies need to be aware of too?
Oh yeah, that opens a whole nother can of worms.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah, can of opening worms session. So BYOD remains controversial in enterprise security because it offers some cost savings and some definite efficiency returns in terms of not having to buy, tens of thousands of phones or laptops for your employees. But it also inevitably brings with it additional security risk, because if an employee brings in an infected phone or an infected laptop that then tries to exploit the corporate network, because you are now inside the corporate network, then that raises a whole host of trust issues and security issues. And certainly if you're an employee who unwittingly and without any bad intention brings an infected phone into the office and tries to print from that phone, and malware on that phone tries to exploit a printer, that's absolutely a reasonable and possible hypothetical, which I feel confident in asserting has already happened.
Yeah, even if we don't know about it, I'm sure it has.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have more of a question about when old printers, old devices sort of age out and enterprises are looking at getting something new. What about ensuring that the data that was stored on that previous printer is completely wiped? Is that possible? Is that happening? And is that a concern?
Oh, it's absolutely a concern, and secure disposal of printer hard drives is critical. There have been HIPAA fines for healthcare enterprises that have disposed of printers with unencrypted hard drives full of sensitive information. First of all, the hard drive should be encrypted anyway, but they should be securely disposed of before. Printers typically have a 2 to 3 year life cycle and are replaced as part of a managed print services contract. And that contract should explicitly require secure deletion and destruction of any hard drives or other sensitive storage media on the printer.
Good point. I wonder, are there, in your research and in the stories that you've written, have you found that any of the printer makers seem to be more sort of leaning into security than others? I mean, I know that there was a story on CSO that said HP, for instance, had started some sort of private bug bounty program last year with like $10,000 in awards if you could, crack the printers. Are we seeing that the printer manufacturers themselves are, obviously they're aware of it, are they doing things proactively to sort of get ahead of the problem?
My impression is that printer manufacturers are actually not the main source of trouble here. I mean, can we criticize them for some security issues? Yes. But I feel that even the many security features, most printers today ship with fairly sophisticated security features already built into the printer. But because of the low margin issue of dealing with managed print service providers, even those tools already being shipped by the printer manufacturers are not being turned on and deployed properly. So can printer manufacturers continue to do better? Absolutely. I don't feel in this particular case that they are the source of most of the issues, which are, turn on the security features that the device shipped with and maintain them and deploy them in a secure manner. And that falls on the enterprise and their managed print service provider more so than the manufacturer.
Got it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think now would be a good time to turn to our audience to see if we have any questions from our viewers on CSO LinkedIn or on our Tech Talk channel. Michelle?
Yeah, lots of comments. One person, Matthew Lemmers, likes JM. Just want to point that out.
Matthew, you've got at least one fan. That's great.
I got a fan.
He says, I like this guy.
Okay, good. We like him too.
He's a CISO. He pointed out what's already been talked about is the storage. So he says IP office equipment. Everyone thinks that they're mundane and and benign, but they should also discuss copiers with storage that never get wiped. And then also somebody says that they need to be wiped from time to time, not just at disposal or at the end. So some comments there. Another person with a comment saying, we've seen many network devices, printers, security cameras, etc., used to infiltrate networks in pen tests.
Yeah.
So.
That makes sense. Those are all, it's interesting. That goes back to the point that you made at the very start, that printers, just like any other connected device, are going to be vulnerable. And of course, that's true with webcams or surveillance cameras or anything that's connected is vulnerable. And that's something that, you have to remember when it comes to the most common thing in the office, the printer,
of course,
that it's as vulnerable as anything else.
that everyone's always grumbling over.
Yeah.
And one of the viewers did bring up a very interesting and valuable point. It is important to wipe these devices from time to time. If you have a printer or copier deployed for 3 years, and that giant hard disk just accumulates sensitive documents over 3 years, then any exploitation over that 3-year period gives you access to every sensitive document basically ever printed on that device. So a regular maintenance of secure deletion and wiping of those drives is in fact a highly recommended security control indeed.
That's a great tip.
And we do have a question also. So I'm just going to read it. It says, eliminating printing replaced by document scanning still leaves multifunction devices open to compromise. Any specific recommendations for the digital office working to eliminate printing as much as possible?
Did you hear that, Jan?
I don't have enough information to give a well-informed opinion on that. I think, there is a move in many industries to move away from paper, and understandably so. Why would you print out if everyone has a tablet? I mean, it's a fair point. But there are industries that remain stuck in paper and will remain stuck in paper for the foreseeable future, such as healthcare. I do not see hospitals or healthcare moving completely away from paper anytime soon. And that remains the case for other verticals as well. In terms of, document scanning, I would need to take a closer look to give you an informed opinion on that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And I would imagine that document scanning, mobile document scanning, then opens you up to a whole other realm of security threats. So
yeah,
there's no one perfect solution.
I was just going to ask to sort of sum up, JM, if you had to offer advice to companies that are, maybe now becoming more aware that this is an issue, maybe the top 2 or 3 things that companies, maybe 3 things that companies should be doing or should plan to do to try to button up these things as best as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the number one thing is if you're going to use a managed print service provider, and there's nothing wrong with doing that, by the way, then your next refresh cycle, you should absolutely sit down with your CISO or CSO or security manager and include security requirements in your procurement RFP. Because that is, like 80% of it right there. If your managed print service provider has no contractual or financial incentive to keep your network secure, then they're not going to, because why would they? They're operating on a very thin margin.
Yeah.
That there's no profit in doing so. It's going to cost you more, but it's going to save you money in the long run. And the second thing to do is, CIOs and CISOs need to sit down and iron out, where does the buck stop? Who is ultimately responsible for printer security as part of the broader enterprise network? And give that person the authority to act to secure those devices.
Got it. That's great advice. And of course, the usual is always keep the employees trained, on security, which is true about every measure of security anyway. JM, a lot of great information here, and I think this is, going to raise awareness, I hope, among companies and employees that their printer is as vulnerable as other devices. So thank you so much for all the information.
It's always a pleasure, Ken. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for being here. Thanks, Juliet, for being here.
Thank you.
As a reminder, we're streaming on LinkedIn Live CSO page today and YouTube. If you like what you're seeing, please follow the CSO LinkedIn page. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Coming up next week, we'll be back with Preston Gralla, who's going to be answering some questions about Windows 10. That's on Tuesday, November 12th. In the meantime, thanks for watching.